Hey y'all, it's Jennifer. Welcome back to my channel. Today I am coming to you with some dark academia recommendations. This time around, it is just specifically classics. Last year, one of my more popular videos was a dark academia recommendations, but that was only modern novels. And I said in that video that I intended to do very shortly a part 2 that was just on classics. I, for some odd reason, apparently never filmed that second part. So we're finally doing that part 2 today, and we're doing it basically because I've been reading a couple of books that I think fit very, very well under the dark academia umbrella. With classics, it's very hard because dark academia as an aesthetic is very much about reading classic literature. That is just one of the things about dark academia as an aesthetic that I think makes people very interested in it. And so it's difficult to recommend classics that truly fall under the dark academia umbrella, because some of these books are kind of books I would recommend you read if you just kind of want to be into the aesthetic. I tried to stick to classics that I think are dark academia in and of themselves, but there could be like a separate video that is all about classics that you should read if you want to get into the dark academia aesthetic, and that are things that I think characters in dark academia books would be reading. There are plenty of classics like that, but I decided to try to stick to classics that I felt like just really were the vibe in and of themselves. So a lot of these are more modern classics because I think there have been so many great modern classics that fall under the dark academia umbrella, and several of those are still on my TBR, but these are all books that I have read and that I really recommend. One of the things about dark academia that I used to be pretty confused about is that I really thought dark academia had to take place in a school. I thought that was the major prerequisite for calling something dark academia. And that's not necessarily true. You can go online and find multiple different definitions of what this is, but a lot of them will tell you that it's just about knowledge. And that is where most of these classics kind of fit into the realm of dark academia, is dealing with knowledge, particularly forbidden knowledge. And you might also call that kind of exclusive knowledge. And that's one of the things that I find most fascinating about dark academia in general, is the sort of exclusivity that kind of goes hand in hand with knowledge. So some of these kind of have the traditional university school setting, but a lot of them are more in that realm of just discussing knowledge and scholarship. And so let's just go on and get into my list. These are in no particular order. The first book that I'm going to talk about is one that you should know is coming if you've been following my channel for any length of time. And this is a classic that can kind of cross over. This can be a classic that you could read to get into the dark academia aesthetic. It's definitely a book that I've seen mentioned in a lot of dark academic books recently, but this is also just in and of itself, I think, very dark academia vibes, and that is Dante's Divine Comedy. I know, I can't make a video on this channel without talking about Dante, but this really works. I think Inferno in particular is the one that is really the most dark academia of the three canticles: Inferno, Purgatorio, and Paradiso. I think Inferno is possibly the one that you want. It's also the most famous component of the Divine Comedy, and there is a lot in it that is about knowledge and understanding, and this is specifically about kind of the relationship between human knowledge and divine knowledge, which is sort of a theme that I have gone with today in this stack, is divine knowledge versus human knowledge science, because that is a really big theme in a lot of really popular classics, and I think it really crosses over into dark academia very well. So Inferno is definitely one of my top recommendations. A little bit more straightforward of a dark academia recommendation would be Demian by Hermann Hesse. This is my favorite book that I have read this year, and it is a modern classic that was published in 1919. And this does have partially a school setting, which is why I recommend it, but it is also dealing with dark knowledge and kind of forming a basis of understanding for the evil parts of the world. And so there is an interesting dark academia component to this that's almost like the forbidden fruit learning something you shouldn't learn. And that's why I think this one feels very dark academia. This is also very lushly written, which is something that I tend to appreciate about modern dark academia novels. And this one is just rife with literary allusions. It just feels very much like a modern dark academia. So I think if you're not really into classics, this might be a good one to bridge the gap if you want to get into dark academia classics. I do think parts of this can be kind of dense, but that really lends to the atmosphere of the book. I think this also has a very clear tone and atmosphere and aesthetic that it is going for, which also feels very dark academia to me. I also would like to talk about Romola by George Eliot. Now, Romola is a Victorian classic, and it is a classic that is set in the 1400s in the Italian Renaissance in Florence, Italy. And it's very interesting to read historical fiction that was written during the Victorian period. It's one of my favorite things to read because it's very interesting to see how Victorians perceived the past. And this is a really interesting one because George Eliot was a very interesting person. And this book really hones in on knowledge in such an interesting way because the Italian Renaissance was a time when ancient knowledge was being rediscovered. And the ancient classics are always a big deal in dark academia modern novels. And they are in this book too, but our main character, Ramallah, is the daughter of kind of a scholar, and she has never been afforded the access to the knowledge that he has. It's just been kind of by luck that she has learned the things that she has. And so this book has a really interesting undertone of discussing the right to knowledge and who has the right to learn. Romola, as a woman in Florence in the 1400s, doesn't have the same access to this new information that's being rediscovered that her male peers do. And that is one of the most interesting conversations that this book tries to have. It is one of the more minor conversations that the book tries to have. It has a very interesting plot, and this also has some really beautiful but dense language in it. George Eliot really did her research, and she wrote the book and tried to make the characters speak in a way that would have been natural to someone in the 1400s. And so there are many different layers to this one as to why I would consider it dark academia. There's kind of what George Eliot, the author, did in her research for this book. And then there is also just the conversation on the page that the characters are having about knowledge and information. And this is just a really good one. It took me by surprise. It's a book that I tried a couple of times and didn't really enjoy. And then I finally read it fully last year, and I just was truly blown away. This is my favorite George Eliot. So this is one that I highly recommend. I think it's a very interesting one in terms of dark academia. Next up, we have two retellings of kind of the same story. And this is the thing that really sent me down the rabbit hole and really made me want to make this video, because it is a story that I think is very iconically dark academia. And so the first telling of this story or this myth is Dr. Faustus by Christopher Marlowe. This is a play, and this is truly iconic dark academia to me. This is really the argument between human knowledge and divine knowledge, scientific knowledge. In many ways, you could say this one isn't as blatantly dark academia as some of the others that I might talk about, but I think the discussions in this one about knowledge, the right to knowledge, who has access to knowledge, and specifically the discussion about knowledge that comes from God versus knowledge that we discover here on earth, make this book very much dark academia. In truth, the time in which Christopher Marlowe was writing was just a time that was rife for dark academia themes, in my opinion. I could have talked about Hamlet here. There are several other poets and playwrights of the Elizabethan Jacobean age who would fit very, very well under this umbrella to me. But I think this is the most straightforwardly dark academia of the bunch. And if you haven't read it, I think it's a very, very good choice. I also think this might be a good one to begin your journey with in terms of dark academia classics. If you were not much of a classics reader, plays are very short and they're quick to read. And there is a lot to dig into with this one. There is so much that you could be annotating. But it also has a conversation about classical literature and mythology, which I think fits in very well with the modern dark academia aesthetic. Because it was written in the Elizabethan age, it is also very, very beautifully written. So a lot of these on this list also have just really lush writing, which feels very dark academia to me. But there is another telling of Faust that I am currently reading that really is the book that made me want to do this video, because as I've been reading it, I've been thinking, gosh, this is so dark academia. And that is Dr. Faustus by Thomas Mon. This one has a little bit more of kind of the university school setting, because a couple of the characters in here are professors. One of the main characters, well, the main character is a musician. And so there's a discussion around lessons, teaching in a way that there aren't in some of these other classics. But this one takes the divine knowledge versus human knowledge discussion, and it really, really elevates it. This is a gorgeously written book. And I think it is playing with its themes in such an interesting and dynamic way. So this is one that I am only about halfway through, but I am obsessed with, and I highly recommend, especially if you were into the dark academia aesthetic, because a lot of the discussions that happen about dark academia, especially with the exclusivity of knowledge, kind of take place on the page here between the characters. And I think that's really interesting. One of the things that I like the most about dark academia is analyzing its flaws. And I think this book is really doing that on the page. It's a little bit more on the science side of dark academia than the classical side, but that's what I think makes this one so very interesting. The next classic I want to recommend is Crime and Punishment by Dostoevsky. This definitely has the university vibe, because our main character is a student who's down on his luck. And this in many ways I think could be compared to The Secret History in terms of a modern dark academia novel. If you vibed with The Secret History in terms of kind of the murder aspect, then you'll really like this one, because similarly to The Secret History, you walk into this knowing the crime and knowing pretty much who committed it. But it's how the book unfolds that is so very interesting. There is a real anxiety level in this that I haven't found in many modern books. The discussions in here aren't so much about book knowledge as they are about human nature. But I think that's also very iconically dark academia, and it's something that is often explored with characters in modern dark academia novels. That is certainly at play here. This is one of the most fascinating books that you will ever read. And I personally think it's a book that's going to reward you more on your second read. I haven't reread it, but I already feel like because I finished it once, the second time I read it is going to be a much more fulfilling experience. Let's talk about the dark academia classic, and I mean the with a capital T, trademarked. I mean, this is the dark academia classic, Frankenstein by Mary Shelley. This is everything that the modern dark academia novel wants to be. It is gorgeously written. It has the university setting. It's playing God. It discusses classical literature. It discusses human nature. This book has it all. If you want one classic that kind of sums up the dark academia aesthetic, you want Frankenstein. This is a classic that I have talked about ad nauseum on my channel, but I highly, highly recommend it. If you have never read this, you truly don't know what you're in for. I think most of us think we know what Frankenstein is because there is so much about the monster in pop culture. But I promise you, you do not know anything about it until you have read this book. And one of the major conversations in this book is that the monster is not really a monster. He's very, very human. And pop culture just totally ignores that for the most part. But this is a genuine treat to read. If you have never read it before, pick this one up. If you can only take one recommendation from this video, I think you should read Frankenstein. Another book that I'm currently reading that I feel like has a very dark academia aesthetic to it is Italian Hours by Henry James. And this is just a series of essays that Henry James wrote across many, many years when he was traveling in Italy. But Italy tends to be one of those places that pops up in dark academia books quite frequently, especially because of its connection to the ancients and classical knowledge. And Henry James discusses that quite a bit in here, but he also really goes for the aesthetic of sitting in the coffee houses, discussing literature, talking with your friends, writing the great American novel. He even talks about at one point becoming a professor and discussing these books, which I just think is really interesting and really has made the book feel very dark academia to me. Again, it may feel less iconically dark academic than something like Frankenstein, but I think it really does have the vibe, particularly in the way that he writes and he discusses things. It's always really interesting to hear him discuss certain monuments and places, but he really just goes for the aesthetic that I think works very well with dark academia. So this is one that I also recommend, even though I'm still currently reading it. Coming off of Frankenstein a little bit, one of the books that is discussed ad nauseum in Frankenstein is a book that I feel like also really fits the dark academia vibe, and that is Paradise Lost by John Milton. And this is an epic poem about Satan and the fall from heaven and essentially the temptation of man into sin. And so this is just iconically dark academia to me for that alone, because in the end, this really does discuss knowledge and who has the right to divine knowledge. Satan wants what God has. And so it's a very, very interesting poem that has incredibly layered characterization. I think a lot of people go into epic poetry thinking, I'm just going to be reading poetry. This really has a lot of character development in it. This is not only one of the best dark academia classics, this is just one of the greats of all time to me. So this is one that I definitely recommend. It's very long, but I think it's incredibly rewarding. Also, in terms of poetry, you know I had to fit a romantic in here. And I think the romantics in general, just that generation of the Shelleys, Byron, Keats, I think they all could work very well as dark academia recommendations. But if you can only have one, I think there is one poet that really goes for the dark academia vibes, and that is John Keats. If you have never read Keats, so many of his poems discuss classical civilization, classics in general. He often comments on works by Shakespeare, John Milton's Paradise Lost, for example, as well. And he also is always discussing history. And so one of my favorite poems by him is kind of discussing the Elgin marbles from Athens being taken into the British Museum, which is just an interesting thing in and of itself when thinking about dark academia. He is definitely questioning the British Museum's right to these pieces. And I think one of the things that modern dark academia has that's maybe a more negative quality is I sometimes feel like there's a level of colonialism and a tone of colonialism in a lot of dark academia novels. And so I think it's interesting that Keats discusses issues like that in his poetry. He's a very rewarding poet. He's possibly, I would say nowadays, the most famous of the Romantic poets. And there's a good reason for that. His poetry is really beautiful. There are so many short poems that you can read to just get into him. But I do think most of the poets of his generation could also be dark academia recommendations. Last but not least is another iconically dark academia classic, and I just don't feel like I could make this video without including this book, and that is The Picture of Dorian Gray. I think this one is less overtly dark academia than some of the others on this list. But I think it has some really, really interesting discussions, and I think it also lays the groundwork for a lot of modern dark academia novels in terms of style, in terms especially of how he discusses art. The discussion of art is such a big component of some dark academia novels, and I think it really gets its roots here in Dorian Gray. So this is one that I would also recommend for a beginner's classic. I think you could definitely start here. This is one of the first classics that I ever read on my own that I wasn't reading in a classroom setting. And it's also just very much iconically dark academia. But there is so much going on in this book that is kind of underneath the surface. And that's what makes the book dark academia, in my opinion. So those were all of my classic dark academia recommendations. I still have a few that are on my TBR. Maurice by E.M. Forster, for example, is a book that I really want to read and I know will really fit the aesthetic. And I also want to read Bride's Head Revisited. I've started it before and I'm not quite sure why I DNF'd it. I would love to know if you have read any of these and if you have other classic dark academia recommendations. But that's going to be all for me today. I hope you're all having a great week. Happy reading. Goodbye.